Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. This is all going to be about monitoring your FileMaker server with Zabbix. My name is Wim de Koort. I am a senior technical architect at Soliant Consulting and also a co-owner at Soliant. And I've been around this community for a while. Actually, my first DEF CON was in the last century. That's how far back I go. And I can make fish talk. Those of you who were here last year can vouch for that. And if I'm not playing with fish, then I spend most of my time either in deployments or in integrations. And as we have seen in this morning's keynote, integrations have become a whole lot more interesting with the new upcoming product there, StampPlay, also known as Claris Connect. This session, however, is not going to be about integration. It's all going to be about deployments.
And my name is Mislav Kos. I am a technical project lead and also a co-owner at Soliant Consulting, where I've been at for over 9 years. This is the second DEF CON that I'm speaking at, and unlike Wim, I can't make fish talk quite yet. Still working on that one.
We believe that FileMaker Server is at the core of your FileMaker solution app working well, right? So to make it work well, performance, stable, secure, that's what FileMaker Server provides for you. And because it is, we think it's critical that we know what happens on your FileMaker Server. How is your app behaving on FileMaker Server? We want to know about all the events that are happening. We want to see metrics. We want to see performance metrics about your app on the FileMaker server. And these were things that we had way back in the admin console for FileMaker server in 16. And we also had the ability to get some emails when that event log registered some warnings and some errors, right? So we don't have that anymore in the current version of the admin console, so we want something that will give us that back. Also missing from the admin console as we currently know it are some configuration settings that are kind of important and that are still there, but we don't see them in the admin console, right? So we want to make sure that, that as administrators or as developers who want to keep track of what their app is doing on FileMaker server, we want to see what those settings are. I've never been a big fan of those two widgets that we had in the admin console, the old one, right? So yes, we could see the live log, and yes, we could see some metrics, but when it comes to troubleshooting, they weren't really great, and I tended to not use them for that purpose. I tended to revert to the other tools that the operating system can give us. So ideally, we want a tool that can do more than just what those old two widgets could do. We want to have a tool that can take action, right? So what if our scripting engine went down? What if our web publishing engine went down? Can we have a tool that takes action when that happens? And no two deployments are the same, right? So for some deployments, the fact that the web publishing engine goes down doesn't really matter, right? Because we're not using it to a great extent, but for some deployments, it's a disaster. So we want to be able to decide what is important, what are the things that we want to see metrics-wise, what are the things that we want to get notifications on for different deployments. And we also want to make troubleshooting better, right? If we set out to find what the cause is of a problem, we want to go to a tool that gives us the numbers, but lets us zoom in as much as it can to where the problem came from. And in addition to that, we want to be able to run some reports, right? So what if the scripting engine had failed? We want to see how often did that happen? How long was it down for? Is there any pattern that we can discern from just looking at some of the reports, which are all things that we couldn't do with the old widgets in the admin console. Now, there are a good number of tools out there that do exactly that, right? That gives us the good metrics, the ability to take action, all of that stuff. If you're working with an IT department of just about any size, chances are that they are already using one of these tools, right? The two last ones on the bottom row there are fairly new. One is Nutshell, the other one is Log Monitor. Those are tools created by the FileMaker community, by developers in the FileMaker community, specifically for FileMaker Server. The other ones are sort of like industry standards, right? You'll come across them, Datadog, Nagios. Now, almost all of these are for pay, right? You have to pay to get into that, and there's a learning curve to get used to them. There's a learning curve to do these tools full stop, right? So if you pick a tool, you have to learn how to use it. And we use Zabbix. And we promote Zabbix. We use it internally at Soliant, and we use Zabbix for a number of reasons.
And some of these reasons include it is open source and therefore free. It has a very active development, and in fact, since we've been using it, there have been significant updates released that have included features that we're happy to have and are already using. They have a very active support forum and a vibrant community, not unlike ours. They have excellent documentation and also a wide range of pre-built templates, which is a way to get you up to speed quickly so that you don't have to create configuration settings from scratch. There's also an upcoming Zabbix Cloud version, which will make the process of deploying Zabbix much faster. And on top of that, Zabbix offers a lot of flexibility and granularity in terms of the information that we can collect and the actions that we can take in response to that information. To use Zabbix, you will need to have a server, and it will need to be a Linux server. And you'll also need to set it up with a database that can be MySQL, Postgres, or Oracle. So at this point, some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, if I don't have a Linux skill set, is this going to be beyond me? And our hope is to show that it is worth it and that it's not that hard. And we're also, to help you along, we're also releasing a set of white papers that will include step-by-step instructions on how to install, configure, and use Zabbix. Once you have the Zabbix server set up, it will monitor your FileMaker servers, but it could be other kind of servers or other kinds of devices. It could be printers, IoT devices, switches, or other network equipment. And collectively, these are referred to as hosts. In a typical configuration, each host will have a piece of software running on it that is referred to as the Zabbix Agent. And this is what facilitates communication between the Zabbix server and the host.
One of the first things that you'll come across when you dive into Zabbix and its concept is that there's this notion of passive and active agents. Very briefly, a passive agent, and it's really a bit of a misnomer because it's not the agent, the thing that you install on your FileMaker server that is active or passive. It really speaks to the item, the thing that you want to monitor, the thing that you collect data for, whether that item is set up to have its data collected passively or actively. And passively means that the agent isn't doing anything until the Zabbix server tells us to go off and collect something, right? In this example, Zabbix server will say, hey, it's time. I want the cache hit percentage for your FileMaker server. The agent will collect that information, send it up to the Zabbix server. Now, the flip side of that is that you can have items that are set up to work in active mode. And in active mode, the agent has a list of things that it knows that it needs to collect. And when it's time to collect them, it'll go off, collect that data, send it up to the Zabbix server. And the main difference between the two, is you can see, is the direction of the communication, right? For one, it's an incoming communication to your FileMaker server, right? So there has to be a port open on your FileMaker server to allow for that. In the other, with the active items, it's the agent sending stuff up to the Zabbix server, so it's the Zabbix server that needs to be able to allow for that. Having said that, in real life, and for the best use of the Zabbix server agent, FileMaker server functionality, you'll have something like that, right? Where you have some items set up to work in active mode, meaning the agent will collect the data, send it up to the server. You'll have some where the item is set up to work in passive mode, so the agent is waiting for the server to tell it to collect something. Now, in this example, over on the left-hand side, you see that one of the items that we collect data for is whether a process, a part of FileMaker server, is running. And in this case, say that the data API process is down, right? So the agent will pick up on that. The agent will notify the Zabbix server to say, hey, your FileMaker server data API process has failed, it has crashed, and then the server can take action. One of the things that we'll show is that how the Zabbix server can perform an action on your FileMaker server, and in this case, it can instruct through the FMS admin command line, it can instruct FileMaker server, hey, restart that data API process for me. So for full functionality, you'll typically have direction between Zabbix server and your FileMaker server in two directions.
One of your first decisions would be where to have the server hosted. And it could be hosted on-premise, either on a physical machine or in a virtualized environment. Or you could choose to use one of the cloud service providers like AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. The server machine doesn't have to be expensive or very powerful. It can be something as low-powered as a Raspberry Pi device. And in fact, Wim has set it up on his Raspberry Pi device as part of the testing that he did. Once you decide where the server is going to be hosted, then you can either do the full installation yourself, or you can choose to use an appliance, which is essentially a virtual machine image that has both the operating system and the Zabbix server pre-installed on it. If your server would be an on-premise virtual machine, then you can download the appliance image from the Zabbix website. And if instead you're using AWS or Google Cloud, both of those marketplaces have Zabbix appliances available. There it is for AWS and for Google Cloud. And in addition to having the options of doing the full install yourself or using an appliance, in the hopefully near future, we will also have an option to use Zabbix Cloud. This is currently in beta testing right now. We presume that it will be a paid option, but it will speed the process of getting a Zabbix deployment up and running, and it'll do away with the task of having to acquire and maintain a server. Once the server is set up, then you will need to install the Zabbix Agent on your FileMaker server. If you have FileMaker Server running on Windows or Mac OS, you can get the pre-built agent installer on the Zabbix website. And if you're using FileMaker Cloud, that runs on CentOS, and that particular Linux distribution uses the Yum package manager, which is the way in which software is installed and updated in Linux. So you would use that to install the agent. As part of the installation, the agent would be set up to run as a service, or in Linux terminology, a daemon. And that is so that it's always up and running and able to communicate with the Zabbix server.
All right, so before we dive into the rest of how Zabbix works and how we have it configured to pick up data from my FileMaker server, we want to jump right to the end, right? So this is an example of a dashboard that you can build based on the items that we collect that are included in the templates that you'll be able to download from our GitHub. The template that we use to monitor our FileMaker servers, it tracks about 160 different data points about a FileMaker server. And to address the issue about how hard is it to set up a Zabbix server, well, funny you should ask, because I happen to have one on me right here. Right? So this is a fully functioning Zabbix server. It is set up to monitor 2 FileMaker servers. It really doesn't require a lot to get into a Zabbix server, and yes, you'd have to set up a Linux server, but it's really, really easy, especially with those appliances that they provide. Hopefully we'll have time at the end of the presentation to show you a video of me building a dashboard exactly like that. It takes about 7 minutes to do that. All right, so if we don't have time at the end, we have the video up on our website, so you can check it out there. Everything that we will show you today is available on our website. You have the white papers already as part of your DEFCON materials, right? So those white papers are guides, step by step, that will explain the options on how to pick a Zabbix server, how to get it up and running, and to configure it with our template and all the rest of the stuff. So keep an eye on this website, on this page on our website. We will update the white papers as we go along, and any updates to the templates and will be announced there as well. Now, I mentioned that we track about 160 different things about our FileMaker server, right? So what are those? And of course, we'll include all the classic stuff, right? The amount of free disk space on your C drive, the amount of memory you have, the amount of memory that's still available. So all the stuff that your operating system exposes to us, we will track in that template. We will also take everything that was in that widget on the old admin console, everything that's in the FileMaker server statistics log, are things that we will track, right? So, and that's a good cross-section of metrics across all 4 traditional bottlenecks, right? So processing power, network, memory, and disk I/O. In addition to that, we will track everything that FileMaker server logs, right? So FileMaker has an event log, it has a stats log that we just saw, it has an access log, it has a topical stats log, client stats log. So everything that FileMaker logs, we will pick up in our Zabbix template. One of the crucial things we have found from experience is that if FileMaker server runs into an issue, it will typically create a crash dump file in the FileMaker server logs folder, right? So it's a file that ends with a .dmp extension. We have an item that will pick up on that, will notify you when that happens, because very often we have found that the presence of such a file is an early indicator that you will run into performance issues hours or days later. So we will track that. As we know, FileMaker server isn't one thing. FileMaker server is a collection of processes, so we will track every single individual process and we'll send out notifications if something is wrong with that. And the other thing that we will track are the actual configuration settings, right? So is the XML enabled? How much is your database cache setting? So we will track those, and because we will track them, we can notify you if they change, but you can also have a history of them, right? So if you want to know what your settings were a month ago, 90 days ago, you'll be able to go back and see those. And this is where the real power of Zabbix comes into play, right? So you'll be able to see all those data points that we track about the FileMaker server, but the real power comes in being notified and having actions taken when something is a problem. To give you some examples, the elapsed time per call, if it exceeds 10 seconds for any given time frame that you think is relevant for your deployment, we can have an email sent out. Like we mentioned this one already, if there is a crash dump file produced by FileMaker server, you'll get an email. The processes, right? So the scripting engine, the data API process, any other process that fails that is part of FileMaker server, we will send out a notification and we will try to restart it for you, right? So in an automated fashion without manual intervention. And like I mentioned, if some of the configuration changes, then you can get a notification as well. And if we put it all together, and this one we're still working on, but if we all put it together, we can have FileMaker server autocorrect itself, right? What if we pick up on the fact that the cache hit percentage falls below 95% for an extended amount of time? We can use the FMS admin command line to have Zabbix server increase the database cache automatically as it goes along, right? So, and obviously it'll notify you, but it can work for you to make that happen.
Wim has given us a sneak peek so we can get a sense of how this will all work and what it will look like once it's all up and running. But before we get there, let's go over some Zabbix concepts. We'll talk about hosts and items and triggers and problems and actions, and talk about what those are. We'll cover the different options that we have to visualize the data that we're collecting, and we'll also cover templates and talk about what those are and how they're used. We'll start with hosts. We did talk about this briefly already, and we'll revisit that here real quick. So hosts, again, are the devices and servers that we're monitoring. And as you start out, you may just have a single FileMaker server that you're monitoring, but you may start adding other hosts as you continue using it. And as that list grows, you may find it helpful to be able to group those into host groups. In our cases, we'll be monitoring, our hosts will be the FileMaker servers for the 3 supported platforms, Windows, Mac OS, and FileMaker Cloud. And as we mentioned earlier, we'll have the Zabbix Agent running on these hosts. We'll use a variety of methods to have the agent collect the data. One of these will be the admin API, and for that subset of the information that we'll collect, that will only work on FileMaker Server 18. Technically, it'll work on 17 as well, but that's going to be true only for another month because in 17, the admin API is in a trial mode, and that's going to expire next month. But for most of the items, we will collect those using other methods. We'll grab information from the log files. In the case of Windows, we'll use the performance monitoring tool, also known as perfmon. And there's other methods that we'll use as well. And so for that reason, for most of the information that we'll collect, it'll work across all versions of FileMaker Server.
All right. So everything about Zabbix is about collecting data from an item, right? An item is something that you want to monitor, that you want to be informed about. So that could be that cache hit percentage that I mentioned before. And once we have collected data about an item, we can then have Zabbix evaluate that. And the evaluation really is all about, is that data that I collected, is it a problem or is it not a problem, right? So I can set a threshold. I can say if it falls below 95%, then I consider that a problem. And you can tweak that for your deployment to make it relevant to that deployment. But that is what the triggers are about, right? So triggers will cause problem records to be created. And those problem records, that's the stuff together with the data that goes in that Zabbix server database. So problems are used to track what the issue was, right? When did it start? When was it acknowledged? When was it resolved? That's the basis for your reporting, so that you can know how often it happens, how long it happened for, that kind of thing, right? And then additionally, you can have an action taken if one of those problems does occur. You can have an email sent out, you can have a text sent out, you can have Zabbix server perform an action on your FileMaker server, you can have it post something to your Slack channel. So there's no end to the number of integrations that you can have done on the action side of your Zabbix server. So in our case, we can have it set up to do an FFS admin command line and do an action on our FileMaker server. So the item is what is being monitored, right? So it could be just about anything that we mentioned earlier a couple of slides ago. Every item has a type, and we mentioned types a little bit. The most common types are going to be your active or passive agents, right? So the agent, the little piece of software that you install in the FileMaker server that is responsible for collecting that data and sending off to you. But it doesn't have to be the Zabbix agent, right? If you really wanted to, you can set up Zabbix monitoring without an agent, so without installing something on your FileMaker server. You would just have reduced functionality if you didn't. Some of the other ways that Zabbix can collect data is do an HTTP call. Or do an ODBC call to the host that it is monitoring. For every item, you get to decide how often you will get the data, right? So the interval is something that you get to decide, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 1 hour, a couple of days, you get to decide that. You also get to decide how long you want to hold on to that data, every single piece of data that got collected for that item. Now, once you get past that set amount of time there to hold on to all the data, Zabbix will pre-aggregate the data. It will, especially for everything that's numeric, it will say, okay, I've collected the cache hit percentage across this hour, whatever the hour is, and it'll calculate the minimum, the maximum, and the average, and then store those values and get rid of the actual individual data points, right? So. These settings here will decide how much disk space you'll need to allocate to your Zabbix server, and there's a good formula on in the Zabbix documentation to calculate how much disk space that would calculate. So you get to decide how much data you hold on to for any particular item. An item gets assigned an application, and that's a bit of a misnomer because an application really is a category. It's a tag. It's a name that you give it so that you can group them. You see some examples there. It makes it easy if you look at your data, everything that you collect. As you can imagine, if we have 160 data points for a FileMaker server, you want to quickly zoom into the things that have to do with, say, processor, right? So that would be a tag that you assign to an item. If you look at what it looks like in Zabbix Server when you set one up, you give your item a name, you pick a type, meaning how will that data be collected, how long will I hold on to that data, and then at the bottom you pick your category or your tags that you want to assign to the item.
Once we've built out a collection of items, then we'll want to create some triggers so that would evaluate the data that's collected by those items and then potentially identify and track problems for us. So when you create a trigger, you will need to assign it a severity, and here are the possible options that you can select from. Which one you choose is entirely your own choice, and that might change depending on the kind of the solution that you're monitoring. For instance, let's say that we're tracking the number of FileMaker clients connected to a FileMaker server. We could create a trigger that tells us if that count goes above 100. And for some of you, that may be the usual number of clients that you have connected, so that's just information to you. It's no cause for alarm. But for others, if you have fewer than that clients connected, that could be a sign of a serious problem, right? It could be a sign that there are ghost sessions piling up in the server, and so you would give that a higher severity classification. The trigger will also have a status. At any given point in time, it'll be in one of these two statuses. It'll start off as OK, and it'll switch to the problem status as determined by the problem expression. An analog to the expression is, in the FileMaker world, would be like a FileMaker calculation. And so this would be something that you would specify. It would need to return a Boolean result, either true or false. True would indicate that there is a problem. And the expression would be based on data that is gathered by the items that we've defined earlier. And the expression would recalculate every time a new value is collected for that item. So if we take a look at an example, suppose that we're tracking an item to see what the free disk space percentage is on the C drive. We would create that item using what is known as an item key. In this example, VFS stands for virtual file system. We're asking for the size of the C drive, and in particular, the % free size. So then when we create our trigger and build our problem expression, we would refer to this item key and then build off of that. So we can use the last function to get the most recently collected value and then do a less than comparison to see if it's less than 5%. In the trigger configuration screen, we can see that we've given our trigger a name, we've assigned it a severity, and we've specified a problem expression. Let's do a visual walkthrough to see how all this works. We have our trigger, and it starts out in the OK status. It's based on an item that we're collecting, and a new value is collected, which causes the problem expression to recalculate. And this time it comes back as true, which means we now have a problem. So the status is switched to the problem state, and as part of that action, there is a problem event that's generated, which in turn causes a record to be created in the problem table. Every time that a problem is identified, it's going to work in this same way, and that's in contrast to when a problem is resolved, which can happen in one of three ways. Let's take a look at the first of those. So we have our trigger, it's in the problem status, and a new value is collected, which causes our problem expression to come back as false. And in this case, we'll rely on that problem expression to tell us when the problem is resolved. So the status switches back to OK, and now an OK event is generated, and that in turn causes the status of our problem record to be updated and set to resolved. So in the trigger configuration screen, we see that we've used the problem expression as our method of resolving the problem, or as they've labeled it here, as the method of generating the OK event. But we could have used a recovery expression. And if we did, then in addition to having the problem expression be false, we would also need the recovery expression to be true. So we would need both of those conditions to be met in order to resolve the problem. Let's look at an example of when something like this might be useful. The remote calls in progress is one of the statistics that is tracked by FileMaker Server, and it can be an indicator of when there is a performance slowdown. And so let's suppose that the solution that we're monitoring, we know from experience that when that count of remote calls in progress goes above 10, that's when users are typically reporting in that things are starting to run slowly. And our goal is to have a trigger that would notify us that this is happening so that we get a leg up and we'd know that it's happening instead of having to wait for the users to tell us. So we could define a problem expression that tells us that that count is above 10, and it's been that way for more than 2 minutes. In the chart that we see on the screen here, we see the dotted red line that shows the threshold of 10, and we see that there are 4 minutes worth of values that have come above that threshold. So now we've identified a problem. And let's suppose that the next 2 minutes comes in and the values there are just under that threshold. And so at this point, how are we feeling about the situation? Right? Do we feel like the problem's behind us? Right? We don't know if our future looks like this or like this. So in this case, it could be useful to have a more stringent threshold, let's say a threshold of 5, and then we can create a recovery expression and see if the values are coming in under that threshold, and only then do we declare a problem as resolved. So in the configuration screen, in this case, we'd see that we have 2 expressions, and they're basically the same except for we're using different thresholds for them. So we've talked about 2 different ways of resolving problems. The second one includes a recovery expression. And then the third way doesn't use either of those expressions. It simply relies on you to manually close out the problem. An example of when that would be appropriate would be that crash dump file that Wim mentioned earlier that gets created in the logs folder when FileMaker Server encounters an error. And in that case, the appropriate action is to restart either the FileMaker Server service or the server itself. That would be a manual action, so you would take care of that manually, and then you come in and close out the problem manually. As the problems are identified, they can be viewed in the Zabbix web front end in the monitoring problems section. You'll see the list of problems in a timeline view, and most of the information on here is clickable so that you can drill in and view additional details. For instance, you can see a sequence of actions that have, as the problem was identified and then closed out, and you can also see a history of when that problem occurred previously.
So one of the most powerful things is that Zabbix Server can take an action. Like we mentioned a few of those already, just sending out email or posting some to your Slack channel or any other thing. So if based on our thresholds that we set up in the trigger, if Zabbix Server determines that we have a problem, then it can take action. I'll walk you through an example of actions that have to do with the data API process, right? So we are tracking the state of the data API process, and if it fails, we want Zabbix Server to automatically try and restart it. So that's the use case that we're discussing here. So the first thing that we will need is an item, right? So we need to track information about the data API process, and for that, and the example that we will give you here is about a FileMaker Server running on Mac, right? As you can see at the bottom there, I have a command that I'll execute to collect data from my FileMaker Server. And since this is a Mac, I can use the Unix-like command line. So Linux, Unix, Mac have a command line called PS. PS will give you a list of running services, and the rest of the command is basically I'm asking it, give me all the processes running on that machine owned by the user FM server, which is the user that runs FileMaker Server. And for the output, that's the -o, I just need its state and the command that ran it, right? So if I run that, I get this, right? If you run the same thing from the command line, you'll get the same thing. There's a couple of statuses that are important. Either the line starts with S, D, or R. If any of those three are true, then we know that the process is fine. If it's any other status as in that first column, then it's not fine. So that's how we can track it. And the rest is basically the command that spawned it. The data API process is all the way at the bottom, right? It's FMWIPD, that's a data API process. So we know that the process is in that list. So that's the first item. This is the item that will give us information about all of the processes that are running on FileMaker Server. Now, we will create a second item, and in this case, it's a dependent item, meaning it's an item that will not collect data on its own. It'll basically just process data that came in from its master item, right? So the master item is the one that gives us the full list of all the processes that are owned by FileMaker Server, and for this one, we'll specifically look for the data API process. And this is where JavaScript comes into play, right? So JavaScript is important in the FileMaker space in general, and this is one more case as to why that is. We're using pre-processing for this one. So we have an item that takes as a value, takes the outputs, this big chunk of text from the master item. That's the value that gets passed into this dependent item. And a little bit of JavaScript, it's only a few lines there. It uses regular expressions to parse that big chunk of text to look for that line that deals with the FileMaker data API process. So the first line there is a regular expression. If you're not familiar with regular expressions, that's fine. There's a great online resource where you can just paste in that big chunk of text that you get from the PS command and then craft your regular expression until you get it right. It's not too complex. It just looks daunting, but it really isn't. So the rest of the JavaScript will say, well, if you find my pattern in that big chunk of text, then I know that the data API process is running fine, return 1 or true, right? If you don't find it in that list, return a 0. So 1 means data API process is running, 0 means it's not running. So based on that item, I can create a trigger, right? And the trigger will do just like Mislav's example, will just use the last function to say, hey, if the last value returned by the item is 0, then we know our data API process is down. That's our trigger. We consider that a problem. And in this case, the severity is a disaster because we really need the data API process for this deployment, right? So that's our trigger. If we get 0, it's a disaster. Now, based on that trigger, we go over to the actions section and we make an action that is based off of that trigger, right? So we create an action and we link it to that trigger. So if that trigger fires, if that trigger evaluates to true, meaning the data API process is down, then this action will happen. And the action, the magic of the action is in the bottom section there. As you can see, I have 2 operations that I do as this action. And the first one is running this command line, right? And there's nothing fancy about this command line. This is the command line that we have. It's fms admin starts the data API process. So Zabbix Server can execute that for us. What we have all the way at the top there, all the way up there, is we've set it to 1 to 5, meaning that our Zabbix Server will try this command up to 5 times. So hopefully it works after the first time, but it will retry 5 times to restart the data API process. So that's how we set that one up. The second operation that we have at the bottom is just to let us know by email that it happens, right? So hopefully by the time we get the email, the data API process is already back up and running. So this is what it looks like in real life, right? So we collect data, and we have this one set to every 30 seconds. Every 30 seconds, that master item that collects all the information about all the processes runs, and then we have a set of dependent items that look for specific processes. So the data API process, every 30 seconds, will return 1 or 0, right? So we can only have 1 or 2 values. It's either 1, running, or 0, it's down. And as you can see, it went down there at, 2 minutes to 2 in the afternoon. So that's the information that we get. Now, if we go look at the problem section of our Zabbix server, the web front end, the front end that we use as administrators, then we can see that the problem got listed there, right? You can also see that it's been resolved. If I click on the actions section over on the right-hand side, and if I zoom in on what the actions were, the oldest event is at the bottom, right? So at 10 minutes to 2 in the afternoon, the information that Zabbix server received was, hey, your data API process is down. Now look at the timing, right? 7 seconds later, the command had been executed successfully already, right? So we were down for about 6, 7 seconds, 5 to 7 seconds. The next interval, which is the last item, happened 30 seconds after the first one. So the next time that we collected data about our running processes, Zabbix Server noticed that our data API process was running just fine, and it automatically resolved the issue, right? So as an administrator, I didn't have to do anything. I will get an email to say it was down, so I can check up on that, but the action was taken by Zabbix Server, the issue was resolved automatically. Since we have a problem like it, we can report on it, right? So I can go back and look at it and figure out how many times has this happened, right? What's my average downtime? Because maybe I'm happy with the fact that Zabbix Server autocorrects itself, but really I would want to know what the root cause is, and I can use Zabbix and its reporting to find out if there's some sort of pattern that I need to tackle.
Next, let's take a look at the different options that we have to visualize data that we're collecting. The first of these is a straightforward concept. We can create graphs in Zabbix. We can do this ad hoc for any items that are based on numerical values. We can also predefine graphs, and if we do that, we can add more than one data series on it. We see an example of that here, where we're seeing the 3 different time per call statistics that FileMaker Server tracks. As we build our collection of graphs, we can switch to them manually, or we can display them all on the same screen. And I'll show you an example of a screen in a moment. Before we do that, let me cover another nice feature of Zabbix graphs, and that is that you can click and drag to zoom in and change the time period that the data is being shown for. And you can keep doing that until you arrive at the time period that you're interested in and you're seeing a sufficient level of granularity. As we build a collection of these graphs, we can display them on a screen, and we can build multiple screens like this so that we can thematically group different graphs together. For instance, here we're seeing a couple of graphs that show information about the processor, but we have other screens as well. As we build a collection of the screens, we can cycle through them using a slideshow, which will switch from one to the next at preset time intervals, or we can switch manually from them. Let's take a look at an example of that. Before we switch screens, we're going to change our time period so that instead of showing just 1 hour's worth of data, we show 3 hours. All the graph data updates accordingly. And now we'll switch from the processor screen to one that's showing information about memory usage. You can see that we've developed quite a few different screens there. We'll show disk activity next, and the last one will be showing a couple of the statistics that FileMaker Server tracks. For any of the graphs, you can click on it and to see an expanded view, and then as we've shown already, you can zoom in by clicking and dragging. In addition to being able to create screens, we can also build out dashboards. It's a similar concept to screens in that it shows different pieces of information on the same page. Dashboards are generally intended to display summary information. For instance, we could show a summary of the problems that have been identified, grouped by severity, or we could show a list of triggers according to their statuses in a color-coded way. You can also show graphs on dashboards and a lot of other different information. The next slide takes us beyond Zabbix to a tool called Grafana. This is not a part of Zabbix. This would require a separate installation, but you can install it on the same server, so you don't need to have separate hardware to run this. This tool is also open source, and the way it works is when you install it, you point it at the Zabbix database, and then you can build a dashboard that displays the information that it pulls from there.
Yep, and building that Grafana database, that's the video that we hopefully have time to show. If not, then you can look at it on our website. We like Grafana because it's a very easy tool to visualize the data. So it's very nifty, and it's open source, so it doesn't cost anything, and you can just install it on your Zabbix server. Now, the last concept in the Zabbix world are templates, right? And the templates, you can download the template that we use at Soliant to track all that information about our FileMaker servers. Templates are a way to bundle your items together, either by operating system, say, or by function, so that you can inherit them and nest them inside other templates. So when you download the template that we have, you'll get all of the things that are on the screen. Really, the big ones are the ones that we are highlighted, the ones that are specific to an operating system that your FileMaker server can run on. Right? So when you set up all your items and then you export them as a template, not everything is included in a template, right? So your item configuration and your trigger configuration automatically are included in a template. Your problem records are not, and that doesn't make sense, right? So, well, it does make sense that they're not included. It wouldn't make sense to include them because they're specific to problems generated on your specific deployment. You may have expected actions to be included in a template, but they are not. The reason for that is that your actions are very specific to your user base. And to your ways of communicating to your user base, right? So for some deployments, you may prefer text or email or like I said, Slack channel or anything like that. So actions are not automatically included in a template. On the visualization side, graphs are included in the templates. And on screens, we're talking about host screens that are automatically included in a template. Grafana, as a separate tool, has its own way of exporting a dashboard as an XML file so that it's, you can import it in any other deployments that you have. Now, back to the template that we have. So this is the one that you can download from our GitHub and import into your Zabbix server and start monitoring your FileMaker servers. And it's really broken down by operating system for your FileMaker server, right? So when you set up a host in Zabbix, when you start monitoring a new FileMaker server in your Zabbix server, you would pick the one template that speaks to the operating system of your FileMaker server, and it will inherit all of the sub-templates. And the reason that we have sub-templates is that there are items that work equally well across all three operating systems. For instance, the fact that FileMaker server has an event log, right, or an access log. It has the same log on all three operating systems. So anything that has to do with collecting data from that is something that we put in the sub-templates that is inherited by the master template for all operating systems. But there are some things that only work on some operating systems, like that PS command to get a list of processes. That one only works on Linux and Mac, or it would also work on Unix. It doesn't work on Windows. Windows has a separate command to do the same thing. So there are items that are grouped that don't work across all platforms. So similarly, there may be some things that work on Windows and FileMaker Cloud, but not Mac OS. The stats log is a bit of an odd duck because there is a stats log that works the same on all three operating systems, but on Windows, everything that FileMaker server writes to the stats log, you can also get with the standard Windows perfmon tool. So we have chosen to use the Windows perfmon tool for Windows deployments. That's the reason that we use the stats log only for Mac OS and FileMaker Clouds. And we are using the admin API where it is available to track configuration information about your FileMaker server. If you don't want to use it or you can't use it, like if you have FileMaker server 17 and the admin API expires, you can get a lot of configuration information from the FMS admin command line, right? So since 17, we have FMS admin get server config, CWB config, so we can use those too. So there's a certain amount of overlap on items that we can collect either from the FMS admin command line or from the admin API. But in essence, that's how these templates work. But like I said, when you set up a host in your Zabbix server, and the host being a FileMaker server that you want to track data for, you would just pick one of the three big templates, right? So you'll either pick the Mac, the Windows, or the FileMaker Cloud templates, and all the rest will fall into place automatically. And as of today, you can download that template with its supporting files from our GitHub. And then there's that web page that we will show the link to at the end of our session here that you can download, or it has the link to GitHub and those white papers.
So we're nearing the close of the session here, and hopefully by this point we've piqued your curiosity and you're feeling interested and motivated to explore further. And if that's the case, then your next steps would be to download copies of those white papers and the templates. FileMaker has also released a white paper and a set of templates, so you can download those as well. Then you would install Zabbix, the server, or use an appliance. After that, install the agent on your FileMaker server, then import the templates. Then you would need to do some additional configuration, like creating Zabbix users and creating actions. And again, our white papers will have step-by-step instructions for each of these tasks. After that, you can optionally choose to install Grafana and import the Grafana dashboard. Our white papers don't yet cover that, but we expect to provide that shortly. So at this point, I think we do have time to show the Grafana video, so we can take a look.
All right, so this is going to be a short video, about 4 minutes, 45 seconds, that shows how to start building that Grafana dashboard from scratch. All right, so let's see if this actually works. So we're starting with a blank Grafana installation, and we are going to create a dashboard. So we'll go to the place in Grafana and create a dashboard. When you start with a blank canvas, you'll start adding widgets, right? So the first widget that we want to add is to show the number of connected users on our FileMaker server. So everything that I pick here from, and it's you can watch that video to see it in a little more detail, but this piggybacks off everything that we have configured in our Zabbix server. And in this case, I want to use a gauge, right? Because that's a nice way to display that those number of users. I'm setting the maximum number of users to 20 because I know for this deployment, 20 users is going to be the max. And I'll set the red line to 15 because I know for that deployment that if I go over 15 users, it's something that I may need to investigate, right? So I'll give it a title, and that'll be the end of setting up that particular widget. So any widget that I set up, I can pick an item that we track data for on our Zabbix server. Right? So the second widget that we'll ask is the remote calls in progress. Mislav already mentioned that. We think that's a really important metric, because if it goes above a certain threshold, it's an early indicator that your users will start seeing slowdowns, right? So in this particular case, I'll set it up to show no more than 30. I'm expecting no more than 10, really, so I'm just setting the max on the access to 30. And this one can just stay a graph. I don't need to change the visualization type. I'll give it a title, and away I go. So there's my widgets. I'll add another one to show entries from the event log, right? So that's the stuff that we had in the old admin console, right? A nice viewer into the event log. So I'll add that one here to my Grafana dashboard. So I'll pick the event log item that we have in our Zabbix, and in this case, I'll show it as text, right? It's just a table that I want to show. And there I have my event log entries. I'll give that one a title, and thank you. So I'll add another widget. The other widget that we don't have is a table of our statistics, right? So in this case, I'll just I'll speed this one up. This goes in fast mode there for a little bit. Because I'll pick not everything that we have in the stats log. I'll just pick a few, something to do with networking, something to do with disk activity. But I could really expand that to show everything in the stats log right there. So I'm just adding queries, columns, if you will, to my table so that it's there. And I'll show that one as a table, and there I have it. I'll give that one a title, and that'll have added it to my dashboard. All right. Then something that I tend to look at a lot is the times per call. So there's a number of metrics: elapsed time per call, wait time per call, I/O time per call. Those are really important metrics to me. So I'll add all three of them to my dashboards, and I'll leave those as graphs so that I can just see what's up there. Give that one a title. So basically, at this point, I have everything that I want to see in my dashboard, and I can just start moving it around so that it makes sense to me, right? I'll just put the two widgets, the event log and the stats log at the top there. I'll have my two graphs. The bottom one is a little too big for me, so I'll make that one a little smaller, and there I have it. I have a working dashboard that shows the stuff that is important to me. I'll save it out, and then I'll show you one very cool feature. Very analogous to what Mislav had already showed that you can do in Zabbix. Grafana does it slightly better. Just like Zabbix, over in the right-hand side, I can pick any preset time frame, right? Like last hour, last day, last week, last 3 hours. So if I look at, say, the past week, I see that I have a little peak there. So something happened on my FileMaker server. That is a serious peak. So if I zoom in on that, all my widgets zoom into the same time frame, right? Including my event log, including my stats log. If I had the top call stats log on there, it would show me the top call stats entries for that period of time, right? So I can just zoom in on the period of time that I'm looking at, and all my widgets, all my information that I'm looking at hones into that exact same period of time. That is stuff that we simply could not do with the old admin console, right? So that's why tools like Zabbix are so much better, far superior than anything we could do in the old admin console. So we hope that we have convinced you that it's certainly worthwhile to invest time in a tool like this.
All right, so we're at the close of our session. We'd like to remind you to fill out the session evaluations, and also want to point out that you can get a copy of these slides and also the white papers at the speaker updates page. We have a link here pointing you to our Soliant consulting page on Zabbix, where you can find the white papers there as well, and also a link to the GitHub repository where you can download the templates. We do anticipate that we'll be updating and adding to our white papers and our templates, so you can visit that page to make sure that you're working with the updated information at any given point in time. And we'll leave the slide up so you can jot down that link if you'd like as we take your questions. Thank you.
Is there any kind of knowledge base for what thresholds you should be looking for in terms of top call statistics and things like that, just as a starting point? You know, when you start looking at these numbers, how do you know what thresholds are normal or abnormal, understanding that so much of it is unique to a solution for some people who are just starting to look at this, you know, myself included, it's hard to know even what to look for as being abnormal.
Makes a lot of sense. That's an excellent question. And like you said, it is dependent on the deployment and the kind of load and the nature of the solution, all of these things. But I think it's a really good thing that we could do. In the template that we have already built in the things that we think are important, right? And they are somewhat generic, but it's I think it's a good call. I think we can highlight those and explain why we set them to be as they are, and then make it a bit of a community effort, right? To have a discussion around that, and people can share what their experiences are. We mentioned some of them in our presentation, like the remote calls in progress over 10, or elapsed time per call longer than 10 seconds for whatever time frame it is. But I think that's great. I think that's something that we can take back and open a bit of a discussion around.
You had showed a dashboard that had about 40 statistics on it. And when it comes to having that amount of statistics and creating problem expressions for common ones like processor utilization, are there predefined problem expressions you can choose from, or is everything from scratch?
Everything is from scratch, except that our templates will provide you a set of, I think, about 20, 30, something like that, triggers. And so you can use those as starting points. But from that point on, it's really up to all of our imagination as to the kinds of things that we want to track, and then how we're going to create those problem expressions to write them. The problem expressions make use of functions, like the last function that we showed as an example, and the documentation provides a list of all the functions that are available. So you can refer to that if you're building your own.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Hey guys, great presentation. I just want to reiterate to everyone, taking your data and visualizing it is taking that next step. Is because I've got 4 servers that I need to monitor, and I used to download the stats manually. And it's not until you put it into something like Grafana, or you put it into the Zabbix visualization tools, you really see the trends between your servers. If you've got 4 servers all talking to each other, then that's certainly a tool that's everyone should take that next step. Don't just download the stats, actually put it into something visualizing the results of what you're seeing. So I just want to say that was a great tool. So superb. Cheers.
Nice.
Thanks. And I couldn't agree more. I think the value that we bring as developers or as administrators is the ability to spot patterns, right? And track those patterns down to events or things that happen on your FileMaker server. And a tool like Grafana, like the dashboard that we build in real life, building that dashboard takes about 7 minutes, right? So I took it down and sped it up a little bit so that we wouldn't spend so much time looking at it. But it's really easy to put it together, and these tools really help you focus and hopefully spot those patterns and let you focus on what you really want to see, instead of, like I said, downloading the logs and wading through kilobytes and kilobytes of pure text to hopefully see the same thing.
Guys, thank you very much. Just want to kind of point out to everybody else, you kind of touched on it very briefly there. If you have an old Windows machine lying around, I think maybe 7 certainly works on 10, you can use something that's built into Windows, Hyper-V, to have a virtual machine. So you don't need to be, if you want to mess around with this, spending money on AWS servers and that sort of thing. And if Linux is not your thing, as they said, appliance is a very easy install once you've got that virtual machine up and running. It's really simple, so I'd encourage everybody, if they have an old machine lying around, try it out.
Yeah, an old machine or a Raspberry Pi device, right? Yeah.
how do you deal with processes that are in an abnormal state? I mean, like web direct, which is not responding, but the process is still active?
A good question. It really comes down, because Zabbix Server can take action, right? I'm not saying that you should configure all these things to try and automatically take action, but certainly it can, and it can save you a lot of downtime. So it really comes down to finding the tools that are built either into FileMaker Server, like the FMS admin command line, or built into the operating system, like the command lines to restart IIS or Apache or anything like that, right? So it really comes down to figuring out, like, if WebDirect is in a particular state, can you track it down to the web publishing engine being down or being in a funky state? Maybe look at the process states for when you get a list of processes. So it really comes down to figuring out what the tools are that FileMaker Server and the operating system gives you, and then making Zabbix take that action for you. If you're not quite confident that you want Zabbix Server to take those actions, then it's really just a matter of making the action something that is reported back to you, including information about the state of say, the web publishing engine, so that you can look at it and look for those patterns, so that you see if something like this happens, I see that it's in this state, so that means something to me.
Okay. Just another question. In your template, do you include the actual user, as the stat log does not include data API sessions, and the new user connection are not logged in the stat log? So we need, the only way, it seems to be the FMS admin command or the admin API.
Yes, it's a good point. The stats log breaks down the number of connections per type of connection, but the data API isn't one of them, right? So there are other ways to track them, but yes, okay. Good point.
I have to bring this down a little. Thanks. Great session, I really enjoyed it. So my question is, have you noticed the more things you track, could it actually affect the performance of the server itself? Or does it make no difference if you're tracking like 100 things?
Yeah, good question. The footprint of the Zabbix agent that is tracking all this information is quite small. And I think at one point we had a slide that showed that information to show just how small it is, both in terms of memory utilization and also how much processor it consumes. And I think the processor, I don't think it ever got above 1%, but it's usually much less than that. I forget what the memory was, but it's basically small enough that it wasn't a concern to us.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yep. It's a really good point, right? Because the act of monitoring consumes resources, right? So you don't want to make that make your FileMaker Server or anything else tip over. It's one of the reasons why Zabbix Server is certified to run on a low-power device like the Raspberry Pi, right? Because it doesn't take a lot of resources to do its job. In fact, when I downloaded the appliance and I had to run it on my laptop, I set the memory to half a gig. It's all it needs, right? So 2 processors, low-speed processors, and half a gig of memory, and away you go. The only thing you really have to take into account is how much disk space you give it, so that there's enough space to track for the database to receive all the data and hold on to the data that you want to report on. Jeff?
I just wanted to add to what they've been saying up here, just as a real-world case. I have 14 servers that I maintain and about 1,000 users that rely on me to make sure that everything is up and running, and Zabbix is really saving the bacon for me. It will notify me that a server has an issue before any customer calls me, and by that time I've had the server rebooted and up and running before the first email comes in from a client. And with the integrations, you can tie it into Slack, and your team knows when something goes down and when it's back up. It's truly just one of those things. It's a tool in your quiver you really should have, and spend the time just to get set up and learn about. It seems a little daunting at first, but once you get over the hump, it's really great.
Yeah.
Yep, thanks, Jeff. And we're here to help you get over that hump, right? So we use it internally, so we're happy to share the knowledge that we have. So if you're considering it and you're afraid of that hump, just reach out, right, on the FileMaker community elsewhere, and we'll help you get going. All right, that wraps it up for us. We'll make room for the next one, so thank you for being here.